for nearly 2 weeks. My phone sat silent when it should have been ringing. Every Sunday evening, without fail, my son Daniel would call. Sometimes it was just a quick update about work or a story about my grandson Jacob and the Lego fortress they were building together. Other times, he'd ramble on about small frustrations at his job, and I'd listen, patient and steady, like mothers do. That rhythm of conversation had been the heartbeat of my week for years, and then suddenly it was gone. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. He was busy. People get caught up in life. But deep down, I knew the truth. Silence speaks. A mother knows the difference between ordinary busyness and the kind of quiet that hides something darker. I called again the next day, and the next. My voicemails stacked up, each one sounding a little more anxious than the last. I sent simple texts. I miss you. Just checking in. Are you okay? But none were delivered. Each time I saw a message failed, my stomach twisted tighter. By the end of the first week, I was restless. I called his office, hoping to hear his voice through the background chatter. Instead, a coworker told me they hadn't seen him all week. Another friend mumbled something about vacation. But even in that casual guess, I heard uncertainty. Their hesitation only fueled the dread already pooling in my chest. 10 days in, I swallowed my pride and called a neighbor near Daniel's townhouse. She admitted she'd noticed strange things, a light flickering on and off during a stormy night. The house unusually quiet for days afterward. She tried to brush it off, but her trembling voice echoed the fear I carried. Every excuse I had been feeding myself crumbled. This wasn't about being busy. This wasn't about a simple trip out of town. Something was wrong. Very wrong. So that evening, I packed a small bag and walked to the bus station. The cold air bit through my coat as I waited, heart pounding like I was about to step into a story I didn't want to be part of. I kept telling myself, a mother knows, and I knew, with a certainty that left no room for denial, that I was about to uncover something I could never unsee. When the bus pulled away, carrying me toward Cleveland and Daniel's silent house, I pressed my hand against the window and braced myself for whatever waited behind his unlocked door. The bus rolled into Cleveland just as the winter sky sank into gray. I stepped off with my bag pressed tight against me, the kind of weight that isn't about clothes, but about fear. The air was sharp, slicing through my coat as I made my way toward Daniel's townhouse. I had been there countless times, and yet that evening every shadow seemed stretched, every silence too heavy. When I reached the steps, the first thing that struck me was the door. It gave when I touched the knob. Daniel never left it unlocked, not with little Jacob inside. That single detail stole my breath. I told myself maybe he had just stepped out for a moment, but deep down, I knew. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was a warning. Inside, the living room looked like a storm had torn through it. The sofa shoved out of place, a mug shattered across the floor, its jagged pieces glinting under the weak light. Dark stains bled into the carpet, and my chest tightened at the sight. I moved slowly, whispering Daniel's name, then Jacob's, though the silence answered back. Each step felt louder than it should, as though the house itself wanted me to stop. Upstairs, I opened one door after another. Empty rooms stared back, bed unmade, curtains half drawn, air stale and cold. When I reached Jacob's room, my hand lingered on the frame. The air felt different there, thicker somehow. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, steady and low, coming from beneath the bed. My knees weakened. My voice cracked as I whispered his name into the stillness, afraid that saying it too loudly might shatter whatever fragile thread kept him alive. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to kneel down. My hands shook so violently I pulled my phone instead, dialing with clumsy fingers, begging for help. The minutes stretched until red and blue lights splashed across the windows. The officers moved past me with quiet urgency, one of them crouching low by the bed. He spoke gently, words I could barely register, before lifting the frame in one sharp motion. There he was, Jacob, my sweet grandson curled up into himself, skin pale, hair matted, clutching an empty plastic bottle like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. His wide eyes stared past us, vacant, unblinking. I wanted to reach for him, to scoop him into my arms, but I was frozen. The officer lifted him carefully, and I stumbled behind them, my legs barely carrying me down the stairs. The bitter night air hit us as the siren wailed to life. I climbed into the back seat beside Jacob, fanning his face with shaking hands, whispering through tears that Grandma was here, that he was safe now. The ambulance doors swung open, and I stumbled after the medics as they wheeled Jacob inside. The harsh hospital lights cut through the night, white and unyielding, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. I pressed myself against the wall while the team worked on him. Voices low but urgent. They slid an IV into his thin arm, whispered about dehydration and malnutrition, checked his pulse again and again as if afraid it might vanish. I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching my coat like a shield, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly. My grandson's small body looked so fragile on that wide bed, his eyes still vacant, fixed on something none of us could see. He clung to that empty bottle even as nurses tried to adjust his blanket, his grip so tight the plastic crackled. That first night, I sat beside him, humming the lullabies I once sang to Daniel when he was a boy. I hoped some memory of safety might reach Jacob where words could not. But his chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, and he never stirred. I whispered promises into the stillness that he wasn't alone, that Grandma was here, but my words dissolved into the hum of the machines. Sitting there, my mind drifted back to when Daniel first brought Sabrina home. She was sweet then, a little shy, eager to fit in. I thought she would love him, protect him. But over time, cracks appeared, gambling, debts, collectors at the door. I remembered Daniel coming to me once, his eyes red with exhaustion, asking for help to cover what she owed. I gave him what savings I had, telling myself it would be the last time. But it never was. And then there were the moments that still make my chest tighten. The day I visited and found Jacob cornered, tears running down his cheeks, while Sabrina scolded him over a glass of spilled milk. Daniel stood helpless nearby, drowning in a storm he couldn't control. When the divorce came, I thought it would bring peace. For a little while, it did. But debts linger long after the papers are signed. On the third night at the hospital, my phone buzzed with a number I recognized from the precinct. I stepped into the hall, my hands trembling as I answered. The detective's voice was steady, but the words landed like stones. They had examined Daniel's living room again, this time with special chemicals. The carpet held far more blood than they first realized. My knees weakened. The world blurred. I pressed the phone to my ear as if holding it tighter could change what I had just heard. Blood in the living room. Too much blood. My heart pounded with a truth I didn't want to face. Something worse had happened. And this nightmare was only beginning. On the third night in the hospital, as the machines clicked and hummed around us, I felt a small tug at my sleeve. For days, Jacob had been silent, his eyes wide and distant, but now his lips trembled like he was trying to push words past a wall. I bent closer, hardly daring to breathe. His voice came in fragments, shaky and raw, like a dam finally cracking. He said it had been raining hard that night. He remembered the sound against the windows, heavy and steady, when the doorbell rang again and again. His father had looked worried, his face drawn in ways a child shouldn't have to notice. Daniel pushed Jacob toward his room and told him to stay hidden under the bed, a simple command, spoken with urgency, and Jacob obeyed, crawling into the shadows, pulling the comforter low. From there, through a narrow gap, he had seen everything. Sabrina walked in, her voice sharp, demanding. A tall man stood beside her, someone Jacob didn't know. His father told them calmly that Jacob was away with me, that the boy wasn't there. But Sabrina didn't believe him. Her voice grew louder, filled with anger, accusations about money and debts. Jacob's small hands twisted in his lap as he remembered. The man shoved Daniel once, then harder. Jacob heard the awful crack as his father's head hit the table. He didn't move after that. Silence swallowed the room except for the storm raging outside. From under the bed, Jacob watched, frozen with fear, as voices muttered and something heavy scraped across the floor. He thought if he stayed quiet long enough, his dad would wake up, but he never did. As Jacob whispered these broken memories, tears spilled down his cheeks. My heart shattered with each word. No child should have to witness something so cruel. I wanted to cover his ears even now, to shield him from his own memories. Fury rose inside me, thick and choking, at the thought of Sabrina dragging him into this darkness. I gathered him into my arms, his small body shaking against mine. He cried into my chest, releasing days of silence in one trembling flood. I stroked his back, whispering that he was safe now, though inside I knew safety was only a fragile illusion. What he had seen was more than a child should ever carry, and what he revealed was only the beginning of a truth that would tear our lives open even further. The detectives moved quickly after Jacob finally spoke. His words, fragile as they were, gave them direction. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions I could barely stand to overhear. And slowly, pieces began to surface. One neighbor admitted she had heard shouting that night, voices raised above the rain, followed by a sudden, sickening silence. Another mentioned a vehicle she didn't recognize, a dark pickup idling too long near the curb. When the police pulled security footage from a corner store 3 blocks away, the screen flickered with grainy images. A truck, headlights cutting through the storm, lingered near Daniel's street around the same time Jacob said everything happened. The picture was blurred, the plates unreadable, but the shape of the cab, the timing, it was enough to raise suspicion. My stomach sank as I realized Jacob's memories weren't just the fractured fears of a child. They were the truth. As the investigation gained momentum, I felt myself pulled back into memory. A few months earlier, Daniel had stopped by my house with a folder of papers. He looked tired, but proud in that quiet way of his. He told me he had finally taken out a life insurance policy, that it would make sure Jacob would always be provided for. I remember him smiling faintly, assuring me that no matter what storms came, his son would be safe. At the time, I felt comforted. It sounded like responsibility, like love carried on paper. But now, sitting in that sterile waiting room, the memory twisted like a knife, because I also remembered the name on the beneficiary line, Sabrina. Even after the divorce, even after all the chaos she had brought into his life, Daniel had left it to her, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of hope she'd use it for Jacob. The realization hit me in waves. She had debts. She had anger. She had every reason to see that policy as her salvation. And Daniel, in his trust, had unknowingly placed a target on his own back. I pressed my face into my hands as the pieces locked together. My son's love for his family, the very thing that defined him, might have been the reason he was taken from us. It was betrayal so deep it hollowed me out, leaving only grief and a burning question how much more truth was left to uncover. I remember the day they asked me to come to the morgue. My knees felt weak even before I stepped inside. The air was sharp with disinfectant, heavy with silence, and every sound of my shoes against the tiled floor echoed too loudly. A clerk led me down a hallway that seemed endless, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, until we reached a steel door. My heart thudded in my chest as if it wanted to turn me back. But I kept moving, because a mother does not run when her child is waiting. Inside, the room was cold, colder than any winter I had ever known. They pulled back the sheet, and there he was. My son, Daniel. His face was pale, lips drained of color, and yet I could still see the boy I once held. The man who used to call me every Sunday just to tell me he was okay. The sight shattered me. I collapsed forward, clutching at the sleeve of my coat as tears blurred everything. I whispered his name over and over, as if my voice alone could bring him back. But the silence was absolute. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at him, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. My body felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the center of me and left only a shell. Not long after, the detectives told me there had been a development. They had found Sabrina's accomplice, the man Jacob had seen with her that night. Rough, unshaven, with a scar along his cheek. He tried to act as though he knew nothing. But the evidence was too much. Under questioning, his bravado crumbled. Piece by piece, the truth spilled out. He admitted to helping her drag Daniel's body, load it into a truck, and dump it like it was nothing more than cargo. He said Sabrina promised him money once the life insurance paid out. His words made me sick, each one cutting deeper than the last. I had once believed Sabrina could love my son, that she might have been a partner he could lean on. But hearing the confession stripped away any illusion. She had planned it. She had watched him fall and chosen greed over humanity. The detectives said they were preparing to move in on her, to bring her into custody. I sat there, numb, my hands trembling in my lap. The betrayal was complete. Daniel had loved deeply, had tried to protect his family, and that very love had been twisted into the weapon that destroyed him. As the police moved toward arresting her, I felt both relief and devastation. Justice was close, but nothing could ever give me back my son. And I knew the next chapter, her trial, would be its own storm. The courthouse was alive with noise that morning, buzzing with reporters, cameras flashing at every angle, and people pressing against the steps as though justice itself were on display. I held Jacob's hand as we walked inside, his small fingers trembling against mine. He kept his head down, but I could feel the weight of every stare aimed at us. It wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. And in that moment, I hated how public our private grief had become. Inside, the courtroom carried a heavy silence, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the low murmur of voices. When the judge entered, the room hushed completely. I sat in the front row, Jacob beside me, bracing myself for the hours of testimony that would carve open wounds I wasn't sure had even begun to heal. The prosecutor began with methodical precision. Photographs of Daniel's living room flashed across the screen, blood patterns marked with yellow tags. Furniture knocked out of place. A blanket stained with his DNA. Each image cut through me like glass. But I forced myself to look. For Daniel. For Jacob. Then came the blurry footage, a dark pickup truck idling outside Daniel's home during that storm. Even though the rain obscured the details, I felt a chill knowing the truth it carried. And finally, they played Jacob's recorded words. His fragile voice filled the room as he spoke of hiding under the bed, of the shove, of the silence that followed. Around me, I saw strangers wipe away tears, but I sat frozen, my body rigid with anger and grief. Sabrina sat at the defense table, her face carefully composed. But as the evidence stacked higher, her mask began to crack. When the accomplice was brought in, his words were damning. He admitted to helping her move the body, to being promised money once the insurance came through. His voice shook, but the truth was clear. It was then that Sabrina erupted. She stood suddenly, her voice sharp and desperate, shouting that she never meant to kill him, that she only wanted the money. The room gasped, the judge banged for silence, and her own accomplice turned to her with a bitter laugh, saying she had planned every detail. I felt my breath leave me. Any faint hope that she might deny it all, that somehow there was another explanation, dissolved in that moment. The betrayal was complete. When the judge finally spoke, the words guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of fraud, the air in the room seemed to shift. Justice had been served, at least on paper. Life in prison. No parole. It was final. But as I looked at Jacob, his head pressed against my arm, I knew the verdict did not close the wound. We had won justice, yes, but peace that was something we would have to build slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet of our own lives. As the gavel struck, I whispered to myself that this was not the end. Healing had not yet begun. Our road was still ahead, waiting beyond the courthouse doors. When the trial was finally over, the house felt unbearably quiet. The cameras, the courtrooms, the noise of other people's voices all faded away, and what remained was me and Jacob, two souls carrying too much grief. At first, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I would wake in the middle of the night, startled by the absence of Daniel's voice, Sabrina's shadow still haunting my thoughts. But in that silence, I realized, was also a chance to rebuild. Therapy became our anchor, twice a week. I walked Jacob into that softly lit room, where a gentle voice encouraged him to draw, to play, to speak when he was ready. At first, he sat there with his arms crossed, eyes far away, lost in memories no child should have. I held my breath through those sessions, fighting the urge to push, learning to wait. Slowly, I noticed changes. A crayon lifted, a small nod, a few fragile words. Healing didn't come all at once. It came like tiny cracks of light breaking through a closed door. At home, I leaned on routines. Mornings were for pancakes, his favorite, with extra syrup. Even when I was too tired to eat, I cooked because the smell of warm batter filled the kitchen with comfort. We planted flowers in the garden, our hands deep in the soil. Watching those first buds rise gave us something to look forward to, something alive to care for. In the afternoons, we walked to the park. Sometimes Jacob ran ahead to the swings. Sometimes he clung to my hand so tightly I could feel his fear. Both moments mattered. Both told me he was still moving forward. I found strength in being needed. My grief for Daniel never left me, but Jacob's laughter hesitant at first. Then fuller was proof that love could soften the sharpest edges of pain. Each small smile felt like a victory, a reminder that the future wasn't only loss. I know healing is not a straight road. There are days when nightmares still visit Jacob, when I still cry quietly at night. But I've come to understand that resilience isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing love every day, even in the shadow of betrayal. It's about believing that broken things can be tended, and lives shattered by cruelty can still be mended. Looking at Jacob now, curled on the couch with a book in his lap, I feel something I once thought impossible: hope. Not perfect or complete, but real enough to carry us forward. If you've ever walked through betrayal, through loss, or through nights that felt endless, I hope you know this healing is possible. It takes time, it takes love, and it takes holding on to the people who need us most. Thank you for listening to our story. If it touched your heart, I invite you to like, share, and leave a comment with your own reflections. Together, we remind each other that love is stronger than grief, and life is worth rebuilding.